Morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. We thought we'd give you an extra few minutes to eat breakfast. I think you know what we're doing here. This is our 6th installment of the President's panel on politics and policy. Some of you know, because you've been faithfully coming, that we initiated this series in January of last year, 2017, at the time that a new president, not this guy, a new president was taking office, and we found on campus that there were lots of questions swirling around how the new administration in Washington and the Congress could affect policy in Maryland, and more provincially, affect much of the work that we do right here at UMB. Our research, our higher education function, our care of patients and clients, and believe me, there are no two better guests to discuss the role of federal actors in state policy than the two we have with us today. We are incredibly honored to be joined by two former Maryland governors, and we're very grateful that they've taken time out of what you know are very busy schedules to help us explore some important topics. Former Maryland Governor Parris Glendening is president of Smart Growth America's Leadership Institute and the Governor's Institute on Community Design. In these roles, Governor Glendening speaks across the country and around the world to environmental advocacy groups, business leaders, and professional organizations. His areas of expertise include smart growth, sustainability, global climate change, land conservation, transit-oriented development, and equity. Mr. Glendening served as governor of Maryland from 1995 to 2003. And before that, he served 3 four-year terms as the Prince George's County Executive, and before that, 10 years as a city and county council member. Former Maryland Governor Robert Ehrlich is senior counsel in the Government Advocacy and Public Policy Practice Group at King & Spalding, LLP in Washington. He advises clients on a broad array of policy matters and their interactions with the federal government. And he has particular expertise in healthcare, finance, and economic development. Mr. Ehrlich was Maryland's first Republican governor in 36 years when he was elected in 2002. Now, I need to tell you, I complained to the governor for what he did to me personally, because, no, it's not a bad story. Not a bad story. When I was chair of pediatrics here, I decided to form a hospital for children board. And one of my first members, and certainly probably the most active, was the governor's lovely wife, Kendall Ehrlich. So he goes and gets elected, and she has to resign from the board. It's okay. Governor Ehrlich began his career as a civil litigator before serving 4 terms in the United States House of Representatives, and before that, 8 years in the Maryland House of Delegates. We have a moderator today. It's not me. I know you're all happy. Bruce DePuyt. And Mr. DePuyt is a reporter with Maryland Matters, an essential website for in-depth coverage of Maryland governor and politics. It's at marylandmatters.org, and I do suggest you check it out. Mr. DePuyt spent more than 2 decades on local TV, including 14 years as host of News Talk on News Channel 8 in the DC metro region. Now, he wanted me to mention that he's a proud graduate of our partner institution, the University of Maryland College Park, where he received his journalism degree. And I'll put in a plug for his podcast as well, the Bruce DePuyt Show. Now, would our moderators and esteemed panelists please come to the stage?
I have to make sure I'm recording. I want to get a story out of this event from MarylandMatters.org. No pressure, gentlemen, but I'll set this right here. So be candid, be lively. Forget that we're recording. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the generous introduction, Mr. President. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's an honor to be with two men who, it's funny, when I look in the mirror, I see my dad. When I look at you guys, I see the same people who have served the state of Maryland so well for so long. So whatever secret gubernatorial, post-gubernatorial health plan you all have, perhaps you can let me in on the secret afterward. But I feel as though I have a special history with both of these fine gentlemen. As was mentioned, I hosted a talk show, a political talk show in the Washington area for 14 years on daily local cable. It was called News Talk, and it gave me sort of a blank slate, a blank canvas every day to talk to anyone I wanted to about anything that I wanted to talk about for an hour each day, which was a real privilege and a gift. My first guests back in 2002 were then governor-elect, because he won the election but hadn't taken office yet. But Governor-elect Bob Ehrlich and the history-making Lieutenant Governor-elect Michael Steele. So I was grateful to you guys for that honor, because it got us sort of launched in a really cool fashion. I've known Governor Glendening even longer. When I was preparing for a congressional debate in 1990, where candidates for the newly created 4th Congressional District were going to be debating. This was a district that was created to comply with the Voting Rights Act. So there was a lot of excitement and anticipation, drama surrounding this debate and this election, and I knew that I needed to be ready and informed and prepared. So I called over to Upper Marlboro and asked if I could get a few minutes with then County Executive Parris, Glendening, who was very gracious and incredibly, candidly, I don't think I've ever known anyone as smart as you in terms of politics. Whoa. I know. Listen, I said very nice things about you, Governor. I said very nice things. I started with you. You never had me to the mansion for breakfast. Let's begin with some opening remarks. Governor Glendening, if you would kick things off. I've got a bunch of great questions here that'll take us deep into our topic. But since you literally wrote the book on federal-state relations, I thought we would get a couple moments of opening comments from you.
Bruce, thank you very much, and let me also just thank you for your contribution to Maryland. Bruce comes from a history when journalism was really respected and focused and knowledgeable, which is increasingly rare. So I'm so pleased to see you continue here as well. Dr. Perman, let me just thank you for the invitation to be here and for your kind words, although I must say you left off an important part of my life, and that is maybe it was because of another institution, but I taught at the University of Maryland College Park for 27 years and enjoyed that greatly and still love the academic part. And yes, my first book was on federalism, but I just last week had another chapter in a book that's coming out now, published on federalism, so I'm still continuing that part of my life. I might add, by the way, that 27 years at the University of Maryland and then 31 years in elected office and now 15 years heading a national environmental. I was introduced up in Chicago at a conference on equity recently along those lines, and I thought I gave, with modesty, a very good presentation and asked for questions. The young lady's hand shot up real quickly and she looked at me and she said, "How old are you anyway?" Now, everyone here understands that at the local office you can be teaching concurrently while you're in office, which is what I did. And I'm really not 107 years old. But in any case, I am pleased to be here and with my friend Bob Ehrlich, who represents in so many ways the fact that you can differ on policy, you can differ on programs, and still be civil, even be friends. And that is a terrible loss that is going on across the country right now. Bob and I have been on several things just recently, working together, even on issues like criminal justice reform and stuff like that. The university has titled this panel here today, "The Intersection of Federal Policy and State Priorities." I must say that is a very exciting academic speak that I know motivated people, but I actually titled my introductory couple of comments here as "The Decline of an Intergovernmental System and the Emergence of Extreme Personal Politics, a Bad Mix." Now, I realize that is also a bad academic presentation title as well, and perhaps not much more exciting, but it does comment a little bit on the challenges facing our system of governance today. In the early part of the American federal system, the debate really was what are the proper roles for national government, state government, and there was a lot of constitutional and legal discussion. And we didn't start to think about an intergovernmental system up until about the 1930s. And my guess is most of you don't think about an intergovernmental system either right now. But in the 1930s, there started to be a lot of discussion about how do governments work together to get things done. It was the New Deal. It was the creation of regional organizations, like later on the Appalachian Regional Commission in the 60s, and even the Chesapeake Bay Commission. And how do you consult? If government has become now so important, again, starting with the New Deal, in everyone's life, shouldn't we be working together? Shouldn't we be consulting? Shouldn't we be coordinating policy? And out of that came the whole intergovernmental structure. By the 1960s and 1970s, every major department of the federal government, every state had offices of intergovernmental relations, and the purpose was to work together, to draw policy together. So much so that beginning in 1959, there was actually created an organization called the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. It brought together governors and members of Congress and the executive branch and academics and tried to sort through what was the best way of doing this. I saw this work personally. I know that when President Clinton first proposed a major reform of the welfare system, the first thing he did was to bring in the governors and the mayors as well as different organizations, and we all sat around the table with the president's people and tried to sort out what was the best way of doing this. Now, the program that came out, some people loved, some people hate, and no one was completely happy, but everyone knew they had a seat at the table, and there was discussion as this was formed. Well, in today, increasingly, that's just not the case. Likewise, it's not just about programs, but I remember in the reconstruction of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge that goes over the Potomac, 295,000 cars a day. We wanted to make it what we called metro ready, so the train could go over when we expand the subway system there. Virginia at the time did not want to do that. It was about $250 million extra money. I remember sitting down with former Ohio Governor George Voinovich, who was a Republican, who chaired the committee, and talking to him, and he said, if you can get the White House to agree that he'll sponsor, make sure the extra money comes through. I remember talking to the head of the Intergovernmental Relations Office, and I remember then going with her to the U.S. Secretary of Transportation and about 2 months later, the budget comes out, and there's the extra money for the bridge. And that, if you look at the bridge down, you see these great big lanes that look like massive pedestrian lanes. They're really not. That's where the subway will go in the future. Now, I say that because that was a system that worked, and it worked not only intergovernmentally, but it worked on a nonpartisan, bipartisan basis, whatever term you want to use. But I ask you just to think about the last year. Now, don't get depressed when I say think about the last year. But think about changes. And I won't go through in detail, but that were totally devoid of any intergovernmental discussions or any real bipartisan discussion. The immigration changes that were announced a few days after the election with no input at all from state and local officials. The tax law that has had huge impact and will be even greater on state and local revenues, including hurting badly states like Maryland, and the details of which were kept secret until the voting started. And you look through the impact there. Or the chaos on the enforcement of the marijuana laws. What is going on right now, 29 states have legalized in one way or another some aspect of personal use of marijuana. President Obama said, well, if this is the case, we can't go enforcing the federal law, and then pretty much directed it not be enforced that way. Now the president has changed, and they're going to be enforcing against individual use, including in the 29 states that have adopted laws that says that it's illegal. And now we're looking at the infrastructure program where they're proposing building all these things, but there was no input from state and local governments at all. And my personal least like the tremendous rollback of environmental regulations. I'm old-fashioned. I think people like to breathe clean air. I think they like clean water. And I notice the tremendous changes that are going on, and they're saying, well, the states can take care of it if they need to. That is not true. Our source of pollution comes from the coal-fired energy plants in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And it's smog, which used to be a regular occurrence and has not been here, will be returning. Now, all of this is going on without any conversation, any coordination, any consultation with partners in the federal system. To make things worse, and I'll be very brief on this and get back into discussion, but complicating all of this is the emergence in very recent years, not just this administration, but the emergence from a number of different sources of a very bitter, very personal brand of hyper negative partisanship. If you oppose a policy, you're considered an enemy of the country. And you become a target for the most vile things being said about you publicly without any effort for civility. The ugliness of the debate really divides the country increasingly into warring camps. Long after this administration has moved on, I will tell you we will spend a lot of time mending and bringing people back together. And what the important thing is to remember, it was not always this way. As Bob Ehrlich will tell you, I remember, he remembers when parties worked together on a regular basis. I worked with people like Senator Mathias, who was a national leader in fair housing. We worked with people like Wayne Gilchrist in Maryland, who was a leader in the environmental movement, or Connie Morella in Montgomery County. All of those were Republicans. I consider them personal friends. We worked together. I also say with a bit of pride that I worked with Republican presidents as well as Democratic presidents. I remember when my son Raymond was just 6 years old, we had a friend with the Secret Service. My son wanted to meet the president and have a picture. They actually took a few moments from the president's time. Of course, I was county executive where a plane landed all the time, but that's a different issue. But they took the time and we had this. I disagreed with them on some policy, but I want to tell you that was a very civil, personal individual, as were both of the Bushes that I worked fairly closely with. And then, of course, President Obama and President Clinton. I say this because it has been a dramatic change in what is permissible and encouraged in the partisan bitterness, and again, combine that with no one consulting in the intergovernmental, and I'll sum it up with a rather dark statement. And I said, and the reason I quoting here is because it's from a chapter that just came out in a book on federalism, but I say that the absence of an intergovernmental system which would facilitate communication, coordination, and compromise, combined with the extraordinary negatives of current political debate, is bad public policy, it's bad for our politics, and it's bad for our country. And I say this coming from a person who is normally very, very optimistic and cheerful about life. I tell one of my speechwriters, Jerry Mincer, I tell her all the time, I say, listen, you have to end up with what I call Cecil B. DeMille ending. Now, there's only a few people in this room that even know who Cecil B. DeMille was, but a great director, when CinemaScope first came out, no matter what the movie was, there was this grand ending where doves would fly and music would go and all this sort of stuff. So my conclusion in following that is that I do have a degree of optimism because we are a strong country with great depth. We have faced challenges like this in the past, and just as we have prevailed and as we've changed in the past, I believe that we would do so now. I'm reminded somewhat of the biblical observation, this too shall pass, and that gives me the strength to keep going.
Thank you, Governor Glendening. Governor Ehrlich?
Speaking for the dumb people here, what you just heard was the professor. and we do it. By the way, Joe, where do you get the bill from this today? What do you get? But we've done this a couple times together. We enjoy each other, and we have obviously profound differences regarding philosophical approaches to issues. But one thing you all should know, and it's very disappointing to the press, the very early morning after we won the race for governor, the first call I received was Parris Glendening, Governor Parris Glendening. Come to the house, hey, come on down, check it out. It's pretty good gig here at Government House, and it was shocking to a lot of people, but not to me. And I know that was a hard call for you to make, and we never forgot it. And from that we've known each other, obviously, as a member of the congressional delegation in Maryland. From that very moment on, our relationship has been one of mutual respect and trust. Not obligatory compliments to the Gov, but it's a nice model for present and past governors in any event. And this one over here, we have had a great relationship. And the greatest compliment a politician can give a reporter is, you didn't do a number on me off the record, right? Which is rule one, and you never have. I never would. Don't start. And and fair. And Bruce was a tough interviewer, right? Very tough interviewer, but you never knew where he was coming from, which is the greatest compliment I can give you. So now we buttered you up. You can ask easy questions. With regard to federalism, I love this. I love when President Trump's called populist. William Jennings Bryan did not recognize this as populism. A Wall Street casino owner. We're not busting the trust exactly here. So when I go to these college campuses and give lectures and talk to kids, I always remind them, please define your terms. Yeah, I'm a federalist. What does that mean? Pure 10th Amendment? What does that mean? Are you Nixonian? What are you? And the bottom line to a lot of policy, a lot of principles with regard to federalism is line drawing. And that's what legislators do. That's what governors do. That's what we do in our own minds as well. Where's that line? What should local government do most appropriately? What should the federal government do? How much rulemaking should occur? 97,000 pages under President Obama's last year in the Federal Register. 97,000 pages. 3,400 individual rules. Where does the regulatory state stop? 60,000, 70,000? Define your terms. And that's sort of my essential message to college kids as I run around. Where are you? And I'll enter a room and I'll say, if you're pro-life, raise your hand. If you're pro-choice, raise your hand. If you're pro-gun, if you're anti-gun, everybody raises their hand. And I say, I got you. You have no idea what I'm referring to, and I just got you and just put you in a corner. I had you self-define. You have no idea how I define those terms. So we see this shorthand a lot in the press, obviously. There needs to be some shorthand, but I appreciate this topic because it's a very interesting, not very sexy issue here. Where do we draw those lines? What is appropriate with regard to local, we'll get into this, local education, for example. What should the feds do? What should the states do? What should the private sector do? Where's that line? And those lines, those respective lines, obviously, define us as generally right of center, left of center, moderates, and the whole 9 yards. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks for the really great turnout. And then we have, this is open book test, by the way. We received the questions before, so we should be pretty brilliant.
But you assume I'm asking those?
I rest my case. But hopefully, and I don't want to get into this now, but hopefully we can get back into why the vitriol, why the relationships, the personal relationships have gone south. And Bruce, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act, and that's an interesting aspect to what's happened in Congress. As the Black Caucus has enjoyed the benefits of the Voting Rights Act, for example, and black membership in Congress has increased, white Southern Democrats, white Western Democrats are on milk cartons. And what that's done is further polarize left and right in Congress. As black caucuses and Republican parties around the country drew those lines, those safe lines, and the Democrats in Washington told Annapolis and other state capitals, maximize your members, and Republicans likewise. As a result, you have 4-4 Republican in Maryland, now 7-1. In Texas, it used to be 2-1 Democrat Gov, and now it's 2-1 Republican. So as those lines get drawn, those lines and how we draw those lines answer a great deal about why all the polarization, why all the fighting, why all the interest in primaries as opposed to general elections, because when you have a safe seat, your fight is generally going to be in a primary from further right or further left, not the other party. And when you have lots of safe seats, which you have in the House today, you generally have lack of incentive to sit down and try to negotiate or actually trying to do the Voting Rights Act today would be almost impossible. And then you go, add on top of that the presence of social media, which makes everyone an independent agent. There are no more uniforms. There was a reason for smoke-filled rooms, right, Professor, Governor? Social media makes it very difficult to sit down with the opposition and cut a deal and negotiate, which is the essence of politics and life when you think about it. So there's a lot going on here, but it's a very interesting topic, and we're ready for our prepared questions.
Part of the genius and part of the challenge of the system we inherit from our forebears is that power is spread quite broadly. At any level of government, you have an executive, you have legislative, you have the courts. And we have power spread among federal leaders, state and local. And obviously everyone's dealing with the same basic set of issues. So it's not as though things are neatly separated. Everyone's dealing with it, education and transportation and all the rest of it, yet in hugely overlapping circles. So it means we've got to get along. It means that when we don't get along, not much gets done. And it means that no one has more than her or his share of the access to the lever of power. Governor Ehrlich, let's start with you first. Can you think back to your term and provide an example or two of how a specific federal policy and or regulation impacted something that was a priority when you were the gov?
Sitting in my office, calling a federal bureaucrat and begging that federal bureaucrat to give me a Medicaid waiver. My health secretary would come to Nelson Sabatini, I'm sure you had the same experience. Literally sitting there and knowing that governors, local officials generally know best what's going on in local communities in respective states and how to provide health care, appropriate health care for your local poor population. Obviously was the issue. And to have literally that phone call and then to wait for an answer sometimes for months was the most frustrating part of trying to deliver innovative health care to our poor population.
This was a waiver to
Medicaid. Literally so that your folks on the ground in your state could take Medicaid dollars, obviously a combination of state federal program, and best serve local needs. But sort of Washington knows best, and that was clearly when I read this question that first came to me. But another observation, by the way, which people tend not to think of, and it's just a reality of life. The local fire department showed up at the Pentagon first on 9/11. And so coming in post 9/11, what really struck me coming from the state legislature to Congress and to governors, the feds have a really serious role to play, CIA, the FBI, with regard to international terror and domestic threat. But when it comes to the realities, the consequences of those actions, it's the local fire department, it's the local police, it's your state police. So issues like interoperability, which sounds pretty technical, become real important. And our technology was not prepared for 9/11. And the ability of our various public service agencies to talk to one another was not there. And I closed, some of you may have gotten caught and still hate me for it, but I closed the Harbor Tunnel one day, if you recall. Actually, I had to close the Harbor Tunnel. When the FBI calls you and tells you there's 4 folks we're surveilling and we think they may want to blow up the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel, you tend to take that pretty seriously. But bottom line is, the Transportation Authority Police, Maryland State Police, were on the front lines. It wasn't the feds. The feds are not there. And so with regard to the reality of post 9/11 Maryland, post 9/11 states, post 9/11 America, the expertise, the interoperability aspects of your local public service agencies to talk together, to work together, becomes very real for a governor. And I'm not sure it was so real prior to the era of terror.
Specific examples for you, Governor Glendening?
2 examples. One on the positive side, and you can tell we were prepped to the questions, but on the positive side was, I'm actually very pleased at the way over the years, up until this last year, we have been able to work on something that I believe would be very important, not just personally, but to the entire state, country, and planet, and that is environmental policy. I'm one of the people that absolutely understand the science of what is going on. The planet is in big trouble. Climate change is very real. There is and there'll be increased flooding right down the street from here. I live in Annapolis. It's already happening. Sunny day flooding, we call it. I watch and work with the countries around the world. Through some delegations that come here as well as visits there, and I see places like Bangladesh literally disappearing right before people's eyes, and the severity of the storms. And yet, the good thing is that in the United States, this issue, again, up until this year, has actually been handled fairly well on a bipartisan, intergovernmental basis. When I say that, we sometimes forget, but the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act, and the EPA, and the Endangered Species were all done under Richard Nixon, and signed into law by Richard Nixon, a Republican. And as we move forward in the years and all of that, I remember working both as governor and then as head of Smart Growth Governors Institute with people like Christy Todd Whitman, the former governor of New Jersey, who was an EPA administrator. When she was an incumbent, she came down and campaigned against me. I won. We talked. She later became EPA, and she is the co-chair of part of Smart Growth America now. Mike Leavitt, the governor of Utah, really a sharp guy. He and I would sit down for lunch and we would talk about some of these policies. I go to Utah now working with them on transit development. And that is an area where it seemed like intergovernmentally we weren't doing enough, there's no question about it. But we were working together, we were communicating, we were understanding one another. And that, to me, is still a shiny point that I hope will return fairly soon. The negative example or issue, I'll build right on what Bob Ehrlich said, and maybe it was because of the trauma of it that it stands out so much, but was 9/11. I was in office during that time. There was a total breakdown of communication. I remember I was giving a speech here in Baltimore, and security came up to me and said, "We have to leave right now." that only happened one other time when I was in office, and you know something is serious. And so we went outside. None of the phones worked. None of the communications worked. We could, by police radio, relate to the headquarters but for state police, but that was it. And so we got back to Annapolis, and it was still the third plane, where the third plane was going to hit, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. But what became very clear to me on the negative side is that the state local actually had its act together, just as Bob was saying, much more than the federal government. What I found out very, very quickly was that they had called up both Montgomery and Prince George's County to immediately send heavy equipment to the Pentagon. They had called up extra the police to immediately help with the additional security for DC operations. And there were inter-regional agreements in place, and everything just clicked in. Vertically, however, it was like no one knew exactly who was doing what. You know, I mean, I got a request it said from the White House, but who knows really where it was. Could we authorize and send over fire equipment? And I said, you know, it's already over there, I was told. And so we checked on our thing, and yes, it was already there. And they did not even realize this. Now, subsequently, two things have gone on. There have been major efforts to improve communication, and in fact, much of it was put in during Bob's administration. There is now a separate system for emergencies, so if there's a crisis, you know what happens. Every one of you will grab your cell phone, try to find out what's going on, and are those closest to you safe, and the system collapsed. There's now a security system for fire, police, and everything else that's independent of that network, so communications can continue. That was put in place under Bob's operation. All of that worked. We strengthened and we practiced, again, the regional coordination, not only for the nation's capital, which is unique, but for here. I will tell you, I still do not have great confidence that if something occurs, and I saw this with the FEMA stuff going on and all, if something occurs, that there's the same understanding and command of how the system works, national, state, local. And that's why you see so much of the real success comes out of the inter-local, interstate actions. And I'm hoping for improvement, but I don't see it dramatically at the national level right now.
Governor Ehrlich, you came to the office of governor with established relationships with dozens or even hundreds of members of Congress. So in terms of the interaction of a state administration with federal leaders, you were at a significant advantage, or you were well ahead of the curve in terms of what maybe the average governor would be. Any governor inherits the delegation that is, right?
I inherited Barbara Mikulski and Helen Bentley, so, that was really
But there are occasions where I would presume where you inherit someone who's very senior and has way more clout than the average person, and they may be someone of another party. It may be someone you really get along with, someone you don't. But in any event, those relationships between governor and senator, governor and congressperson are hugely important, can benefit the state when they're good and not when they're not.
I think it's still this way, but I still remember you coming over as a member of the House, bringing the cabinet over, which a tradition I continue. I believe Governor Schaefer did as well. The bottom line is that even in a hyper-partisan era, with regard to this issue, which is state of Maryland, how are you doing in D.C., what do we want to do, what are your priorities, governor, cabinet, we're really good. And I mentioned Senator Mikulski and Congresswoman Bentley. Those two really ran the show. They ordered everybody around, and we were all scared of them. And they made it very clear, both of them, that this is Team Maryland, and we need to work together. So egos and philosophical differences and party, this is a uniform, and it's yellow and black. And that certainly was my experience in Washington, both as a member of the delegation, Governor Glendening, and I was as governor. Because there are certain sacrosanct items on the agenda forever, the Chesapeake Bay, transportation dollars, military bases. we had a BRAC go down during my tenure, and BRAC is really interesting. Talk about failure of structure, failure of internal fortitude.
That's
BRAC,
the base
base
closing
closure. So BRAC came about because Congress didn't have the ability to close military bases with regard to individual districts itself, so they come up with a fast track. When Congress can't act, when it lacks the discipline, doesn't have the votes to do things it needs to do, it fast tracks. That's why trade pacts came about, by the way. So with regard to BRAC, it's tough because if you look at our state, and you look at Pax River, and you look at Fort Meade, and you look at APG, you are talking about economic engines. Talking about academic institutions, Mr. President, big time. Military bases, go to northeast Maryland and pretend APG's not there. Or southern Maryland, pretend Pax River's not there. So the ability to work together to protect Maryland and grow Maryland's interest, because one of the unfortunate aspects of BRAC is it's a zero-sum game. New Jersey loses, we win. That's what occurred in the last BRAC. We got their job. So we're not smoking cigars, running around celebrating, high-fiving, because we know there's pain in another state. But the bottom line is, it's serious, real politic business. You look after your business in your state. Senator Mikulski, Congresswoman Bentley always made this point. They led on this.
And there's got to be trust, right? When you're in the room.
You know what? It wasn't even, in my era, it wasn't even questioned. It was, this is what we need to do. When Governor Glendening came over and said, these are my priorities, bay cleanup, transportation, whatever it was, everybody sat down, figured out where the requests, where the asks went, which committee, what subcommittee, and we worked together, and there was just no ego. It's a very unreported, underreported, but positive aspect of how the delegation operates.
I want to make sure we do marijuana, Governor Glendening.
Did you rephrase that?
Did you have any thoughts on the illusion? Oh, I mean the question of marijuana policy. Oh, they took it in a completely different direction than what I did.
I didn't
Sorry,
hear a
Rick.
comment after that.
I apologize for the audience.
Semicolon.
Let me just, and I know some people that are watching the talking heads and the different channels, so nowadays probably disappointed in the fact that I agree about, and we're not going to be attacking or whatever, but I agree exactly what he said. Maryland has had a tradition of working together on a bipartisan basis with regard to the federal government. I would like to say this is because of the superior intellectual capacity of both Marylanders, but the truth of the matter is, going back at least to the 1960s, we are a small state that is inordinately dependent on so many different aspects of federal expenditures, including simple employment of federal, maybe for entirely different departments, but live in the Maryland suburbs. And that, I say with great pride, that year after year, Maryland often ends up as either number one or number two in median family income in the entire nation. Why is this, other than great gubernatorial leadership and everything? The answer is in part the federal presence, and everyone knows this, and so we work together. I do recall over and over on different things. I remember going down and talking with Congressman Hoyer about some need for the Baltimore port here. He ends up setting a meeting that afternoon with the congressman who was in charge of the subcommittee that handled port appropriations and all, and we sat down, we talked for a little bit about it, and we left, and I said to Stenny, I said, he seemed a little bit dubious. He said, well, you know how many requests he's getting, and I said, so? And he said, so the money's going to be there. And it was, because Stenny Hoyer is very, very skilled. I go with Elijah Cummings, the same thing. And across the board, you got the support. And it was a team. It was working together, and still is largely. I would say there's only one member of the delegation now who doesn't completely seem to understand that, but everyone else, without regard to party, very much so works together. When I was in the party, it was actually 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans in the House. And you would not have known that if you were sitting in these meetings, not just glad-handing, but actually with your cabinet, and that preceded weeks of prior meetings with staff to start to work out the details and things of this type. And so it was a good system. It still functions largely the case, but the problem is Congress is not functioning as well. But we are doing our part.
Yeah, and I need to add, just because we're so close here, that port is a major economic engine. We tend to lose sight of that. It's pretty. We cross the bridge and we look at the ships. And Congresswoman Bentley was relentless in all respects, but particularly when it came to dredging and working with Steady and the senators. So we could go after examples, but if you're talking really about the major issues, certainly dredging, port, transportation, looking after our military facilities.
The port just had its second largest tonnage in the last 60 years. If it were not for the significant federal funding that we received to widen the channels coming in, and the combination of Congresswoman Bentley and Congressman Hoyer, that never would have occurred, because you have to come an extra day up the bay. So we're at a competitive disadvantage, and it's only our ability to do those type of things that put us at an even key.
The only time I was ever able to shut her up was when I surprised her, named the port for her that night. She just, it earned me like a day or two.
I just want to suggest to our organizers that I'm going to regard the timing recommendations as purely advisory. So there's a lot to discuss here, and I'm just going to plow ahead. It's hard to think of an issue where not just potential conflict, but real conflict between the states, the state of Maryland and the federal government, where the conflict is particularly intense, is on the area of marijuana, what some would call marijuana reform, where some states are moving quite far ahead in terms of decriminalization, medical marijuana, potential legalization, but they seem to be doing so in apparent direct contradiction of federal laws that are on the books now. So in some ways, this is a very weird wrinkle in our system, that this is the status quo today. Either of you who wants to jump in on this, go ahead.
I'll jump in since you singled me out before. It is a major controversy, but it's also, I think, a reflection of something that we have seen in our federal system over and over. And that is when substantial policy disagreements start to bubble up from the communities, community by community, state by state, and you get to a point in which the national government is almost, if you will, forced to reconsider what is going on. This is not something new, and I applaud it. And the reason I applaud that, where would we be as a nation if we had not seen such resistance coming about in terms of voter rights and desegregation and women's equality and Title IX, as it's now called, the federal level? Most of these things started at the state and local level, and people started recognizing and changing the state law. The most recent, of course, was the massive changes that occurred with regard to gay rights, gay marriage, and things of this type. There was a point at which the national government, which still had and is still debating among itself whether certain people can be admitted to the military and whether or not you have security clearances and all. Absolute nonsense. I mean, my brother, who was in the Air Force for 19 years and was gay, and he died of AIDS, and he was telling me on his deathbed that the thing he regretted most was if his sexual orientation was known, he would have been dishonorably discharged from the Air Force that he loved. Now, the reason I say this is, if we did not have this type of resistance on these major issues coming up through the states, the national government, because of the way that Congress is scheduled and the way the president is elected, would still be 50 years ago. We're seeing the same thing on two major issues right now. One is immigration, which states and many local governments simply say, I'm not going to be part of that. I don't care what the federal law says. You can do whatever you want, but I am not going to be part of it. And given this as sanctuary cities. The second one is the marijuana. I happen to think that the change in laws are good. Like Al Gore, I never tried it, except for once when I didn't inhale because I don't like smoking. But all that notwithstanding, why, as governor, and you ran into the same thing, I'm sure, one of our functions was pardon. The number of people that would come before us who, when they were 16, 22 years old, had been arrested for drug possession, and it was marijuana, and now they can't get licenses in certain areas, they can't teach, they can't work with children, they had the box that they have to check, were you ever arrested for a felony? This is nonsense. We're putting so many people in jail, we have to change this policy. And so what has happened is, in most, we now have 29 states have legalized in some aspect of marijuana. By the way, I don't even make the distinction between those that have done recreational use like Colorado and those who have done just medical use like Maryland. And the reason being, I've been told that state after state what happens. People go to their doctor and they say, Doc, I am really stressed out, my job, my back, whatever it is. And in the past, it was some type of tranquilizer. Now, increasingly, apparently, is some aspect of marijuana. And so even the distinction there. So what is going to happen? This is the interesting question. I gave these presentations for the U.S. Department of State for delegations coming in, and they said, well, how can you have the federal law say it is illegal and you'll be arrested and go to jail, and the state law say it is legal, and you may open a marijuana farm, and you may have a dispensary, and you may get a license for this. Why don't they just go down and arrest everyone that's running the farm? And I said, good luck. I said, the first federal officer that goes into Denver and tries to arrest someone for having a farm there, we're going to have this eruption. The truth of the matter is, notwithstanding the current administration, President Obama kind of backed away from the whole thing and said, okay, guys, don't enforce the law on individual use if a state has a contrary law. That was a reasonable compromise, but it didn't require Congress buy-in or anything else. Attorney General Sessions is now saying it's the law, and I'm going to enforce it. I think he's going to run into huge political and resistance problems on that. But I see this not as just a question of marijuana, just a question of immigration. I see it as good policy change coming from the states and the bottom up. We used to call it the laboratory for democracy. And without that, when you think about it, otherwise, people making decisions are elected in places like Montana, which I love, but politically they're a little bit different than we in Maryland. It's very hard to get fundamental change on basic issues like gay rights, like immigrants' rights, like marijuana, unless you have the state standing up and saying, no, it's a different world, you're going to change. And I'll make the guarantee, without any hesitation in my mind, the federal government will move to the same broad interpretation, which will probably be against illegal organized distribution, but permitting individual use under a regulatory system.
And that will come about how, in your prediction?
It will come about fairly soon. They got 29 states right now. What has happened in a number of other things, and the gay marriage is a good example. You started getting lawsuits, individual and organizational lawsuits over this. You started getting political resistance. 10 years ago, even in Maryland, no one would have run for office saying they're either going to vote for or had voted for changes in marijuana 20 years ago, in gay marriage and things of this type. And today, it's almost a checkoff item. If you're not there, you're not going to be supported. I think that's increasingly the approach nationwide. I'm actually enthusiastic about these changes because I'm less enthusiastic that the nation as a whole can pull together on fundamental changes of that level. And you asked me the question first, and I was enthusiastic and didn't even...
I disagree. No, I actually agree with you. Some of what you just heard. These are two entirely different issues. And one, with regard to marijuana possession, alcohol, marriage for that case, these traditional, under federalism, traditionally state issues. Immigration is almost exclusively a federal issue. So if you're going to treat them the same, I have a whole list of laws I can't wait to not enforce under a Democratic president, too. And so it doesn't work that way. The question is about marijuana. which is a fascinating issue. I live with a drug court prosecutor. If you are a Maryland governor and you serve local, state, you serve in federal office, you've been to a lot of jails, talked to an awful lot of prisoners, young juvenile prisoners. So none of us take this, regardless of where you're on the issue, none of us take the issue of yet another way to get high lightly. And we do that, if we do that, we do it to our own detriment. I do distinguish between medicinal marijuana and social use, recreational use. I was one of the first Republicans in Congress to come out for, in fact, medicinal marijuana, and took a lot of abuse as governor from the Bush White House. In fact, got calls from the White House, what are you doing? With regard to end-of-life situations, with regard to terminal pain situations, I'm for all the above. And that was my position then, and it's my position today. So now, the fact it's being abused, I agree. You know, the Ravens had another bad draft. Oh, I got to get high. I mean, I get that. I maybe had a good draft, I hope, but the last 4 years have not been good. So there's a lot of abuse, no doubt about it. My wife sees it all the time. But you cannot take the issue of yet another way to get high lightly. Now, I am not, many of you know my history, I was one of the few Republicans to praise Mayor Schmoe in the 80s when he came out and said, we need to have this debate, because this is silly. We certainly, and Governor Glendening's absolutely correct, with regard to possession offenses generally, I think it would be a huge mistake for the feds to follow the Attorney General. And so this sort of mix, looking the other way, the whole 9 yards, and President Obama sort of backed off. That's generally would be my view. That's generally the way I would see this playing out because, again, what Parris described. These issues are traditional state issues. You let the state, the laboratories of democracy, under federalism, do their thing, and you see sort of which way the cultural values are going. But there's a price to pay here. There's a mental health price to pay here. There's a serious health generally price to pay. Again, it's different from opioids, but clearly this is another entirely important issue that is just raging in our society and causing lots of deaths and causing lots of bad phone calls to my home at all hours of the night. The issue of marijuana legalization, again, needs to really be brought forth in this context. So with regard to the answer, I distinguish between medical marijuana, medicinal purposes, and legalization possession. I would agree generally with the Obama MO, and I hope President Trump follows this with regard to backing off of possession offenses. I would not support backing off of distribution. I still would draw that line, and we'll see where this goes with regard to the states in the coming years. But I hope we have a more serious discussion at the state level nationally on this issue because it's needed.
I haven't done a very good job of managing the clock. Do we still have time for an audience question or two?
Oh, we have plenty of time
Good.
for audience questions.
Microphone in the center of the room, whoever can get there first. Yes?
I can yell loudly enough. You know, the level of political vitriol and acrimony is about as high as it's ever been. Do you have any hope in the foreseeable future that is likely to change? And if so, how will it change?
No. Semicolon. Again, we can talk about this with the political scientists here, but the emergence of a sort of English-style system, clear right, clear left, labor Tories, as a function of line drawing, has not helped our democracy. Governor Glendening earlier talked about dysfunction in Congress. We have 13 appropriations bills. It's 1/3 of the budget. Neither party wants to deal with entitlements. Their lack of guts is startling in both parties, and that's what's really driving $21 trillion we owe our children and all that. But just with regard to the 1/3 of the budget, when I was a member of the late 90s, early 2000s, at least we were passing 6, 8 a year appropriations bills. Now, the reason you get these multi-thousand-page appropriations bill at the end of the year is they can't pass literally one or two appropriations bills a year. That's a dysfunctional, it's that way under the Democrats, it's that way under the Republicans. And by the way, everybody loves that because there are no rules. There are no rules. By the way, despite nothing's perfect in life, nothing man-made, but in Annapolis you have 90 days and you don't have a printing press. And you have pretty solid committee discipline. So things get done, there's real process. In Washington, there are literally no rules, no committee rules. Everybody's a free agent, and again, as I said earlier, social media has exacerbated the problem. Because it doesn't, nobody's playing a team sport. And if you're a member of a committee in Annapolis, it's still that way, in fact. You need to get things done. When I was a member of the legislature, some of you who don't follow this may think this is a terrible idea, but when I was a member of the legislature, this was enforced. If you hated a bill on second reader on the floor, if you hated it, you literally had to vote with your committee. That's how state legislators and legislatures get business done, because they got 90 days, no printing press, they have to actually have a balanced budget, and there are rules. In D.C. today, both parties do not respect rules. It's dysfunctional. And so am I optimistic that it's going to get fixed in the short term? And that has nothing to do with Obama or Trump or polarizing presidents or anything else. That is a structural problem under both parties. I told you I was going to bring it down. Honestly, I don't bring them up. I bring them down. I leave them down. But it's a serious problem.
Let me add just a couple of quick points on this. And I know sometimes this stuff gets boring, but there are major institutional structural problems that we have that must be addressed. The number one of which, and I was part of the problem, and that is the redistricting. What has happened now is with the computers and everything else, you are able to draw a line that literally goes down the street, turns on this corner, turns here, and you look at voting patterns and you have it instantaneously, and any one of you could go out in 2 hours' time and draw a district that is absolutely to your liking. And so what happens is you are in a district now that is extreme. There's no center to that district. And you can do and say anything you want as long as you keep that base happy. And it's the Democrats and the Republicans in that case. And I was part of the redrawing when I said we had 4 and 4 districts. We redrew them. And we ended up at that time with 6 and 2, and now it's 7 and 1. And that became, unbeknownst to any of us at the time, that became so refined that anyone can do that anywhere now, and you see the problem. Second big institutional one was when the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court, said that you could not restrict money, that somehow or other money was an expression of free speech, and therefore if you were a billionaire and you wanted some extreme action of the left or right, go ahead and drop $50 million into a campaign. Go ahead and keep it secret. Go ahead and run nasty, nasty ads that it says, Committee for Good People. And you have no idea who's behind the Committee for Good People, and except that they're spending one heck of a lot of money. And so you start to put these things together, and what you end up with is a system that's sort of structurally wrong. Then you look at the way the U.S. Senate is composed as well, and that's not going to be changed, but we need to come about with some methods that brings the Senate more to the center as it used to be. You used to have some of the most progressive senators, Republican and Democrat, from states now where they're afraid because of these other tools to do anything whatsoever. And so the system is broken, but I'm, again, an eternal optimist. The system was broken in the past on a number of times. It was broken with regard to race relations and slavery. Hopefully we're not going to have a civil war. But it was broken with regard to income and what was happening during the Great Depression. It was broken in the 1960s with voting rights and with the assassinations that were going on and with the poverty and the urban riots in the 60s and 70s. These were major breakdowns of the system. We are in a breakdown of the system now, and it's time for us to correct it. And we can do it.
I have a thought that might bring you up a little bit. Hamilton was hiring surrogates to attack Jefferson. This is not new. If social media was around, you can imagine what Jefferson Hamilton would be saying to each other. So when human beings fight over power, this is a byproduct. It's just the vitriol has crossed the line lately, but we always have, that's what America's about, speech and dissent. That's what democracy is.
Let me insert a thought here, if you don't mind, because I didn't want to lose the conversation about medical marijuana and its impact on this campus, which is one of the reasons we have this forum. Medical marijuana appears to be a good idea, but the data supporting the efficacy and certainly issues of safety, how long do you use it, it's very thin. And a place like this, with a pharmacy school like we have, ought to be doing that kind of research. And because of the conflict between state and federal, we understandably have our Attorney General advising us that the faculty would do it at risk. So there is a penalty to be paid for this conflict.
Good point.
Please.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Elise DeLate. I'm a graduate student in the nursing school and president of Students United for Policy, Education, and Research on campus. And you touched on a little bit, especially with marijuana decriminalization, but I was hoping you could talk and provide some specifics on the work you both are doing related to criminal justice reform and how state and or federal priorities might be helping or hindering the progress on that issue.
I'm going to let Bob take the lead in this because he's been doing so much, and you're going to be surprised with this, but he and I have been working on this issue in several different aspects together. Bail reform has been one of them, which is just a ridiculous, outrageous system. Life in prison without parole, of which I started that policy, and it was a terrible, terrible mistake, and we're going through that. The elimination, of course, of the death penalty, and just the judicial process overall. And I'm pleased Bob is spending a significant amount of his time, so I will turn everything over to you.
Well, again, this sounds like we're being too kind to one another, but for Governor Glendening to say what he said recently about some past thoughts he had, you never hear politicians say, hey, man, maybe I was wrong, maybe this is a better way to do it. And to have the Gov do that means a lot, and a lot of people appreciate it. I'll tell you, that's leadership. It's easy to be a politician. All you have to do is say things to be popular and get enough votes. That's no talent. To be a leader, it's much more difficult. With regard to public justice reform in Maryland, it's interesting because I had never practiced criminal law, but coming into office, I just thought this is part of the job. This is what you do. And so bottom line, some of you know this, I had monthly meetings wherein we would review petitions. Again, very interesting. A lot of these petitions, and Governor Glendening earlier alluded to this, a lot of these were very easy. You get in a bar fight 17, you're now 42, you're trying to get NSA clearance, you need a pardon, easy. Change some of those facts. One DWI 15 years ago, okay. 2 DWIs, now you're trying to be a bus driver, maybe not. I mean, these are interesting calls, but I thought that it's an economic empowerment issue, and with regard to Maryland governors, you have extraordinary power to restore lives and achieve justice. And that's the bottom line why you get paid as governor, justice. The more difficult cases clearly are lifer cases. They're commutation cases. What you're doing is you're commuting life sentences to a period of years, which then results in parole. So literally, if you commute one of these sentences, you are guaranteed someone gets out on the street who has been serving a life sentence. We did a bunch of those. I thought the equities called for it. I've taken that activism as governor. And when we did this, by the way, I had no idea this would be a major part of my legacy, but it is, because now it's cool to do. It's the great purple issue of our time. I have a clinic at Columbus School of Law dedicated to criminal justice reform in the country, and with focus on collateral consequences, particularly employment. Next question.
Good morning. My name is Anita, and I work with Elise. The question that I have actually has to do with one of the subjects that you brought up as far as gerrymandering is concerned. And what I wanted to know is, why is this law or practice still being incorporated, and why is it still going on as far as our governing system of voting, funds, grants, security, and what would or what do you think needs to be changed? Why or why not change it?
Because it's counterintuitive for politicians to give up power unilaterally. That's the answer to your question. Period.
So is it power for the individual person that doesn't want to relinquish that power? And I thought you were for the people.
I can give you some names in Maryland right now, but California, La La Land, has done it pretty well.
Yeah.
They had an independent commission and they actually came up with districts that made sense. So it can be done, but it's going to be very unusual for state level leaders, legislative leaders, to give up that kind of power because the national parties are going to be crushing it.
If I had a comment to it as well, it is a major problem, and now that people have figured out how to use it for adverse, nefarious means, it's very difficult to give up. I mean, you're not going to find a governor, a Republican or a Democrat in the future says, hey, you know, let's draw this plan a little bit fairer and go back to the 50-50 and the other party can have half of the seats. That's just not going to happen. However, some things are going on that I think are very important. The public is starting to understand this, and the public is starting to demand, and there are other ways. And I happen, by the way, to agree with Governor Hogan on this issue, that maybe it's time for some type of more independent commission to pull this together with tight guidelines. 5 or 6 states currently use that, and you know, they haven't collapsed. If you put the guidelines in and enforce them, including some degree of compactness and so on. But the second part, and I think more states are going to do this, and especially states where there's petition for changing the Constitution opportunity, the initiative process. The second thing is the courts. Now, this U.S. Supreme Court is extraordinarily conservative as a result of the last appointment. But even this court might make some changes, but certainly the lower courts are. When it is so obvious that there are adverse impacts, and this was deliberately intended, it becomes a voting rights issue. And so at several different levels, now the courts have intervened and have overturned districting plans. Eventually, this is going to have to reach the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court looks at it as a matter of law, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm proudly a political scientist, but if it gets to the Supreme Court, as a matter of law, I suspect there's a good chance the court would overturn it. If it gets to the Supreme Court and is framed primarily as a political question, then this court ideologically is probably not likely to be. Now, they might punt and just say, listen, this is not the role of the Supreme Court. They've done this in the past, and leave it up to the next lowest court that has decided, or to a state court. And if they do that, we will end up with rather an odd situation. For example, the Pennsylvania entire state redistricting plan is in danger of being thrown out. Several congressional seats are being redrawn across the country. In some cases, it's so obvious the consolidation of minorities, particularly African Americans, into one district. So you go an urban cluster here, you draw a thin line down the interstate, and you pick up another cluster over here, and all of a sudden you get a district that is 95% African American, but at the same time, there's no African American voice in 3 other districts that are in that immediate area. That is a legal question. You've diluted the vote of a group. And this is where I think we're going to be.
Well, there's a couple issues here. This is why everybody needs to be careful about immigration and open borders. To the extent you invite folks here and they want to vote, you degrade legal citizens from voting. One person, one vote. That's a serious issue. Be real careful what you wish for. Secondly, I alluded to it earlier, these African American districts are a function of the Voting Rights Act. Now, there's a case in the Supreme Court, I believe, that basically is, well, we really didn't mean to do that. I have a friend in the Black Caucus in Congress, I won't mention his name. He called me after the last reapportionment in the state, and he said, hey, I went from 98% African American to 92%. I'm safe. Right. And so what's happened over the years is, and by the way, who's going to resist this? Black caucuses. They don't want their power to be diluted. So Black caucuses and Republicans around the country and states said, okay, well, we'll draw lines. And that's why you have almost no moderate to conservative white Democrats left in the House. Because those lines have focused black votes, as you said, African American votes, in minority voting rights districts. Black caucus is happy. The Republicans are happy, and white Democrats are gone. And by the way, those Democrats were the third party in Congress when I was a House member. They brokered lots of issues. They brokered lots of social issues and tax issues. What do you call them? The boll weevils, the blue dogs, whatever you call them. They're gone because of this line drawing. Understand, this is so. What started out as a very good purpose has evolved into maybe not exactly where we meant to. But when you try to undo this now, you're going to have a lot of pushback from members of Black Caucus. So, yeah.
And I was, it happens that I covered the Supreme Court hearing on the Maryland redistricting case, and one of the big issues, it's clear that they're going to be wrestling with, and there's an obvious joke about pornography, but it's like we know gerrymandering when we see it, but what do you do about it? What's the metric by which a given map is ruled to be too political? I mean, this strikes me as an issue that cries out for a national solution or standard in some way, because to say...
It doesn't. This is a state, this is federalism.
Well, here's the thing.
States do.
If the premise is that the way this group or that group drew the lines was partisan, because it was done to maximize their results, the results in the next election, and how it would advance their fortunes, then there has to be some element of realism when because you don't want to be I don't think you want to be in a position where you tell these guys, hey, please disarm in the middle of a battle while these other people continue to do what they're doing. I was listening, and I mentioned this because I was listening to a podcast recently where a journalist in Texas talked about how the Texas legislature carved up Austin, the most liberal part of the state, so they have zero, it's a major population
Just
center.
like Maryland's carved up. You have one state Republican seat, all the other Republicans are marginalized. Purposefully. Both parties do it.
Not in the pizza slice way that they did to Austin, because you're talking about very different views.
Well, check Maryland's 3rd congressional district when you get home, but
not
before you eat.
I think the 3rd congressional district in Maryland is one of the worst all-time districts ever drawn. But again,
It's not an insult to Congressman Slarby's, by the way.
no, it's a hideous district.
But we have done a great job identifying the problem.
But the fix is what?
Well, right. Okay, here's what we better be careful about. Giving hyper-politicized judges this kind of power. And Governor Glendening and the Supreme Court is actually talking to the country, the Chief Justice Roberts, actually talking aloud with, geez, be careful what you wish for. You have judges and drawing
So the fix is what?
California. So anytime I'm going to say that, by the way, fix California.
So the state's just on their own going independent.
If the people, listen, here's the problem. We can agree on this. We're going to leave here today. Nobody cares. Nobody understands this. If the people actually make this an issue, really make an issue, it's not. It'll poll 1% if you're lucky. If it starts polling, you might actually get some people in the legislature reacting. Until you get to that point, no way.
I'm told we have time for one final question.
Good morning. My name is Yolanda Santa Rosa. I'm the HR generalist at the School of Dentistry, and I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank Governor Ehrlich. I happened to be accepted into the governor's internship, fellowship when you were governor, and that's where I learned and developed my love for policy. The policy paper that the group that I was with worked on was witness intimidation.
Oh, yes. Huge issue. That was a planning question, by the way.
How's that for a Cecil B. DeMille ending? Thank you,
Gentlemen, this is more than we could have even hoped. Governor Glendening, Governor Ehrlich, Mr. DePuyt, on behalf of the university, we thank you for spending this time with us. It was wonderful. Thank you.